Greetings everyone, Barrett here with Hammerhead Model Making, and we're back with another full build video. Today we're going to be tackling the Tamiya 148 scale A6M3 Zero. Now this kit and all the paints you see were kindly provided by Hobbies. They are a fantastic model supply shop based out of Canada, and I'm extremely grateful that they were able to send this kit down, as well as the paint, and do a little bit of a collaboration here. So I would highly recommend checking out Sunward Hobbies. You can find their website information down in the description below. But they appear to be quite well stocked with pretty much most of the major scale modeling brands, and their staff is extremely friendly and kind. So yeah, they definitely get a big thumbs up from me. So check out their website, and yeah, let's go ahead and crack on with the build. So this is the second Zero that I've done on the channel, the first one being an Eduard kit. So it was really interesting for me to compare the two, because the Eduard kit is largely heralded as, like the gold standard, and it's definitely a fantastic kit. But Tamiya has their level of engineering that no one seems to rival in the scale model scene. And obviously, you could make an argument that like Bandai is at that level, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. But Bandai doesn't necessarily produce the same types of models that Tamiya does. So within like genres, Tamiya is kind of the gold standard here, and this kit definitely does not disappoint. So we're gonna go ahead and start out in the cockpit, which is pretty common with scale model aircraft, and there's already a big noticeable difference between this kit and the Eduard kit in the part count for the cockpit. This has about 1/3 fewer parts in the cockpit than the Eduard kit does, and you could definitely say that Tamiya kind of tends to err on simplification in favor of fit, engineering, and ease of build. So there are a few little instances where maybe the details aren't quite as detailed, for for lack of a better word, than the Eduard kit. But the kit does go, the parts do go together extremely nicely, and definitely have no qualms and issues here. And in the end, I mean, the Zero is a fairly small aircraft, and the opening into the cockpit is quite small and tight anyways. So the argument could be said, well, you're really not going to see much of that amazing detail anyways, and you wouldn't necessarily be wrong. But there is like a group of scale modelers that, for them, knowing that the detail is there, even if it's not seen in the final build, is enough. And I tend to fall into that camp most of the time. But I mean, I would easily build this kit or the Eduard kit again, without hesitation. Both of them were enjoyable. Both of them in the end produce a very nice looking Zero. So as you can see here, working on the cockpit parts, it all kind of goes together pretty logically. I try to build into subassemblies as much as possible, as much as it makes sense, and so that I can minimize the overall amount of like priming and painting and individual tiny little parts that have the potential for getting lost or misplaced, things like that. So when I can, I try to do subassemblies. So here I'm kind of doing like the back bulkhead of the cockpit, and then the sidewalls mostly get attached to the inside of the aircraft fuselage, and then you have like the instrument panel, the firewall, things like that. What's cool about this kit is the way that it's built up. The cockpit actually sits in from the bottom of the cockpit, or from the fuselage. So you actually put the two fuselage halves together first, and then the fuselage then slots into the bottom, and it's really nice. And And at first I was like, ooh, I hope it fits, but nope, I shouldn't have worried. It fits perfectly. So at this point, the actual construction stuff is done. So now we're going to go ahead and get it all prepped for painting. So I'm just using my little blue tack, my poster putty here that I pick up at the dollar store, and to attach my parts to some craft sticks. This just helps make painting easier, and I try to group things in ways that would make painting easiest. It's if everything's going to be black, then I put all the black parts on one stick. If everything's going to be interior green, I put all those parts on another stick. That kind of thing, just to kind of make it easier when it comes to painting and priming. So here we do the back. So this is kind of like the back side of the engine area, and you do get some decent exhaust detail there, and they, with the cowl flaps open, you can kind of see it a little bit. So it's nice that they included that detail. The main engine cowl is all one part there, so they did some slide molding to get that engine cowl together, and it looks pretty nice. So we're going to go ahead and add a few little details to the engine here. This is just basically doing some ignition wires. The cowl opening for the engine is really, it's not very big, and so you don't, and then you have the propeller and the big propeller hub, so you don't really see a lot of the engine once it's done. So I'm not going like crazy detailed on here, but it's hard for me to pass up a radial engine and not detail it. It's just, I enjoy doing it, and it's one of those things where it adds an hour extra time to your assembly, but the detail that you get out of it, I think, is totally worth it, and really looks nice in the end. So just using some micro drills here. I'll put a link down to where you get in the description below where you can get these. I just get them off of Amazon, and I think I get like 30 or 40 drill bits for $16. They're fairly inexpensive. They do occasionally break. If you noticed in the footage just a little bit ago, I ended up breaking one of those drill bits. So, but I usually find they last. The 30 some odd drill bits that you get will usually last you a year or more. And so if you're looking at $16 a year on drill bits, I think it's a decent, cost. I think it's fair. The actual engine itself builds up really nicely, and it's well detailed. I like that you have the separate push rods. That's always something that makes me happy and really helps make an engine look better. So here I'm just inserting a length of steel wire into the ignition ring, and once the super glue dries, then I'll go ahead and trim them and bend them into the actual spark plug holes that I drilled in each cylinder. And I do have another video on doing this type of work that goes into a little bit more detail and depth on how to do this. I'll go ahead and link that one down below as well. But it's a pretty straightforward and simple process. Now you could, absolutely go way more detailed, because just adding simple wires, it looks good in the end, but the ignition wires really are a lot more complicated than just a simple wire. So there's definitely things that can be done to push this even further, but base level, this is pretty good, especially at the scale, and I don't think you can go wrong. So it's just a matter of getting these all bent and into place. Kind of takes some time. I ended up snapping one of them off. That happens occasionally, where the super glue is, I didn't have it in far enough or enough glue on there, and it pops out. No problem, just replace it and move on. So there we go, finished engine. It looks nice, and what little of it you'll be able to see, I think, will look good on the final product. You do have to drill out the gun barrels. So these are for the two machine guns that sit over the engine, and excuse me. And so what I'm doing is I'm putting a little pilot hole as close to the center of the gun barrel as I can, using an old airbrush needle, and then using the guide hole, the center hole, I can now drill out the gun barrels. It's really helpful to have that guide hole with the airbrush needle. Otherwise, you might risk slipping your drill bit ruining your part or stabbing yourself in the finger. Ask me how I know. So it definitely helps. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and prime everything. I am using Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black, thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner. And we're going to go ahead and just give a nice good coat over everything. I tend to, I would say, over thin my Mr. Surfacer. So sometimes it takes 2 coats to get a good solid coverage on there, but I prefer that than having it, overly thick and creating like texture. So just what I prefer. I do struggle, and I've talked about this in the past before, but the Mr. Surfacer primer, I do struggle finding like the right paint or primer to thinner ratio. With the Mr. Color or the Mr. Hobby Aqueous primer, I find that way easier and much more forgiving, but just a little bit harder to find locally. So that's why I have the Mr. Surfacer 1500. So now we're going to go ahead and apply our colors. So I am using the Tamiya instructions for all of my color guides. I know very little about zeros, and it's just easier for me just to go off of the instructions. I'm going to assume that Tamiya, being a Japanese company, would do their homework when producing a Japanese aircraft, and they would get their colors, pretty good. So, yeah, gonna go ahead and go based off of what the instructions say, and call that good. So we are going to be using the Tamiya range of paints on this one. Again, those were sent to me by Sunward Hobbies. So that's why for all the airbrushing you'll see is the Tamiya, but for brush painting, I don't like using Tamiya for brush painting. I will be using Vallejos for all of my brush painting needs. And right now we're going to do a little bit of sponge chipping. And so I take a little section of sponge here, and I'm using my tweezers to kind of tear it up a little bit. This is going to help make the surface uneven and rough and create some variation in there. And then we kind of dab off a lot of the paint, similar to like you would with like a dry brush, and we go ahead and dab that paint on. And it's a really fast and effective look. Is it the most realistic? Not always, because if you overdo it, you tend to get blobs of paint in places you may not want. But it is a good way of, if you're learning or trying to do new weathering techniques, this type of chipping can be really effective, and it really is pretty easy. So yeah, just adding a little bit of chipping to the interior of the cockpit here, just to add a little bit of wear. And now we can go ahead and start painting up some of the control boxes and things inside the cockpit. Again, we're just using some Vallejo paints here, and thinned with just regular tap water. Thinning Vallejo is, it's not like an exact science, and I wish I could say like, oh yeah, I always do 3 parts to thinner to 5 parts to paint, and you'll always have a perfect consistency with your paint. Unfortunately, I find that Vallejo paints vary from color to color in how much you need to thin it, and so I largely thin it based on just feel. Like, how does the paint feel? I'll know when I have the right thinning ratio, because the paint it'll flow nicely onto the part that I'm painting. I won't have to like force it, but I also don't have to it doesn't feel like I'm flooding it. So I really wish I could tell you what that it's hard to convey in words what that feels like, but that's basically what I'm trying to achieve when I'm thinning my paint. And so typically what I'll do is I'll put a little bit of paint on, like you see in the background there, my palette, and then I'll get a little bit of water on the brush, put the water next to the droplet of paint, and then I can move between the two as needed to find that right mixture, that right ratio. And if I were using like a wet palette, for example, it would make the thinning a little bit more, I'd be able to keep it a lot more consistent between because the problem is with what I have there is that eventually the water starts to evaporate, so you have to add more water, and you have to, try and get back to that ratio. So sometimes it can be a little tricky like that, but I always find that I end up I have a wet palette, but I always forget to use it, and then at that point it just becomes another useless tool, and it's easier for me to have my little palette out there. But anyways, whatever works for you guys, that's great. So for the exhaust here, I'm going to show you a little technique that I like to use for doing not necessarily rusty, but like heat metal that's been changed and decolorized from heat use. So I'm going to show you that a little bit later, but it's pretty simple and straightforward, but I like the look of it, and it works for me. So we're going to have it give everything a nice gloss coat. This is just using my favorite Alclad Aqua Gloss, and seal all in all of our paintwork, and prepare it for some weathering and decals. Go ahead and use my favorite brown wash for green vehicles by Ammo MIG, and this is going to really help make a lot of those surface details and recessed details pop in the cockpit. This particular aircraft that I am modeling was a land-based Zero, and there is a nice reference picture of the aircraft that is available, and it shows it it's not like completely like beat up and hashed like you'd see many late war type Zeros, but it does show wear. It does show that it's been used. And so my interpretation here is that the cockpit's going to get a little dirty, and especially for as a land-based aircraft, in the South Pacific, the pilot's going to be walking across the ground, tracking dirt and debris and who knows into the aircraft, and so there's going to be a little grime in there. The decals for the instrument panel, fortunately, are all supplied as separate little clusters, which does make it a little bit easier, but I struggle with Tamiya decals. They're just way too thick for me, and I know that's kind of like a common complaint, and I do know that there are people out there that get really nice results from Tamiya decals. I just haven't figured out how. And I mean, and these decals were even resistant to my Walther Solva set here, which is a pretty hot setting solution for decals. I mean, it will easily melt thin decals, but it almost didn't even touch the Tamiya decals. It is what it is. So once the Ammo MIG wash has dried, which usually takes about 30 minutes, I can go ahead and wipe away the excess with a cotton bud. The combination of using the gloss coat and then the wash makes it really easy to do this. I mean, it literally just wipes away. I don't have to use any enamel thinner. If there's a particular area where I didn't get enough gloss coat on there, I might have to get a little bit of enamel thinner, but generally it's pretty forgiving. So we're going to go ahead and add the seatbelt decal, and again, I'm going to struggle with the decal just because it's so thick. And I think if I were to do this another time, which I definitely want to, it's a great kit. Definitely going to get some aftermarket seatbelts and probably aftermarket instrument panel, just so I can avoid having to use the Tamiya decals here. But so what I'm trying to do here is just use the Solva set to kind of gently start getting this to conform around the edge of the seat. I'll leave it raised off of the seat a little bit just to kind of create some depth, but at this point we can go ahead and seal in all of our work here with a matte coat using the Ammo MIG Lucky matte varnish. This stuff is kind of thick, and so trying to find that right thinning consistency can be a little troublesome, but once you get it right, I mean, this goes dead flat. It's really nice how flat it can go. So now we're going to go ahead and assemble all of our cockpit parts. Again, Tamiya engineering here at its finest. Everything just kind of like slots into place, except for where my fat fingers start launching pieces. But there's always like a really nice positive place for everything, so that it leaves very little question in your mind where parts are supposed to go. Yeah, it's fun doing this little cockpit unit. For as small as the Zero aircraft is, there's a lot going on in the cockpit. It's a very busy cockpit. So you could definitely have a lot of fun super detailing this, really going all out, similar to like what the Edward kit does. But I don't find that necessary at this time. So we're gonna go ahead and move on. At this point, we can start putting the fuselage halves together and start building everything up. You do have to add this funny little piece here that helps to support some of the engine cowling stuff. It's an interesting choice that Tamiya made to do that, but it works. So don't, I'm not gonna knock it. Just strange is all. But you have to get the parts all lined up, and then everything just kind of snaps together. And you can go ahead and get your fuselage glued together. You can see here that it fits really nice. And in the end, getting the seam lines cleaned up was really easy, really straightforward, and really didn't have to use a lot of like filler and all that stuff. So that's always something that I enjoy. The less time I have to spend filling and sanding, the more time I get to enjoy the build of the kit. So I'm going to just use a little clamp here to help hold everything, to squeeze everything together while the glue sets. This is that little cowling piece I was telling you about, so it just kind of fits on top there. It also has the machine guns poking through. So, but the nice thing about all these little separate panels is it means that there's just less sanding that you have to do in and around what would be really delicate parts there. So here we go. We can fit our cockpit into the fuselage there, and it just, perfect fit. So, yeah, and then it looks really nice. So now we're going to go ahead and start working on the seams. So I'm going to start off with a jeweler's file, and this is a pretty rough file. So it's going to remove a lot of plastic really quickly. So I'm using very light pressure. Really, what my goal here is to just even out the plastic so I can get them level, each half level with each other. And now I'm going to come in and start with the sandpaper to really start refining that seam line and cleaning it up and making it look nice. So really, you don't want to use the file very much, just to kind of knock down the initial step between the two fuselage halves, and then come in with our sandpaper to really clean that up. And I'm going progressively getting higher and higher grit sandpaper. At this point, I'm using 2000 grit sandpaper and wet sanding it, and this is really going to help polish up that plastic and make that seam line pretty much disappear. I did have to fill a tiny little area with some super glue, but it really wasn't very much. So now we're going to go ahead and get some areas pre-painted, like the inside of the wheel wells, and a couple other places before we start getting them installed into the rest of the aircraft. That way, just a little bit less masking that I have to do later on. This Tamiya color, it was kind of tricky to get it spraying right, and I found it was either like super thin or super thick, and trying to find that right happy medium took me a little while, but I was able to get there. So we can go ahead and get this installed in the lower wings. And this version of the Zero had folding wingtips. Now, initially, I thought that was designed to help save space on an aircraft carrier, and I always found it really odd that it was like, well, why just the wingtip? Like, that just doesn't seem like that's saving all that much room on an aircraft carrier. But I was doing some research and realized that the reason that the Zero has the folding wingtips like this is so that it could fit on the elevators of the aircraft carriers. And so those wingtips would give it the clearance it needed to get on the elevator and then get up to the flight deck. It wasn't meant to as a, save space in storage in the hangar deck. So I thought that was interesting. Now, How often would a land-based Zero have its wingtips up? Probably not very often, but I wanted to display them in the up position, so that's what I'm doing. I have no like photographic evidence that they kept the wingtips up on land-based Zeros, so it might be inaccurate, but it looks cool, and I wanted to use the feature on the kit because I'm a sucker for options. You do get a polycap in the center wing section here. This is so you can install the drop tank. Interesting choice. I don't know how often you'd be taking off the drop tank and putting it back on, but nevertheless, it is there. I think if I had to find a fault in the Tamiya kit, it would be these ejector pin marks inside the flaps. So the kit gives you the option of having the flaps down, but there are unfortunately some large ejector pin marks on both the inside portion of the wing as well as the actual separate flap part itself. So I used my hobby knife to scrape those away, and then I did some sanding and cleaning up to hopefully make those disappear, because kind of unattractive. The tail gets installed here, so there's a separate rudder and a separate tail part there. It looks really nice. The horizontal stabilizers get installed. These were a two-part affair, just a top and a bottom half. These all went together without issue. No problems there. They fit nicely. You do have an option here for the arrestor hook or this blanked over part, which I'm using because it's a land-based aircraft, not a carrier-borne aircraft. Here is the drop tank, and that pin that sticks up is what goes into the polycap and the fuselage. So, I mean, it's nice. It makes for a good place to hold the part while it's being painted, at the very least. And here are the wingtips. So, very nicely that Tamiya did the tops and bottom halves of the wingtips where they join along panel lines so that there's less cleanup there. The ailerons going on, they are separate, but they are designed to only be put into one position. So if you wanted to have the ailerons in any kind of deflection, you would need to cut off the tabs, basically. The front inserts for the guns on the wings, and then now we can fit the wings to the fuselage. And again, fit here was nearly flawless, and very few issues there. These two little seam lines at the front, those will need to be taken care of, as those are not present on the actual aircraft. Edward, Tamiya does supply you with a little bit of photo etch for the folded wing options, so you do get a little bit of like the internal wing structure here as photo etch pieces, as well as those two little supports that hold the wingtip up. Now, Tamiya tends to use pretty thick steel when it does its photo etch, so I was a little concerned that the only parts holding up the wingtips would be the photo etch, but honestly, there's very little chance that those are going to get bent. So before I install any of the cockpit glass, I am pre-painting the back deck of the fuselage here black, since that would be pretty impossible to paint once the clear parts are on. And so I masked off the rest of the plastic just to avoid having any overspray on there, and it turns out pretty nice. Now we can paint up the gun sight, and I tend to hold off on doing things like the gun sight until I'm ready to install the canopy parts. I just find it makes it easier to avoid losing it, breaking it, or misplacing it. And so I usually keep it on the sprue until it's time to get installed, at which point I'll take it off, paint it up, and then get it installed. The actual glass parts for the gun sight are pretty thick, and they have a seam line. So again, on a future build, I would replace those. But clear parts going on, these fit flawlessly. And now we can go ahead and mask up the clear parts. Now, Tamiya does provide you with, masks for the canopy. The only thing is you have to cut them out yourself. They're not pre-cut like you would find in Edward. And if you cut them correctly, they fit perfectly. But if you miss something, it can cause you problems. So you really have to be careful when cutting these out. I need to invest in a smaller pair of scissors. It would make that a little bit easier, but I was able to make my way through it, and I do appreciate that they have like the little arrows so you can, pointing to the front, so there's very little chance you're going to get the wrong, masking piece on the wrong portion of the canopy. And so we're going to go ahead and move on to the painting portion. Now, prior to paint, I'm going to go ahead and give the entire model a wipe down with some isopropyl alcohol. This will just help remove any of my, greasy finger marks and anything else that might be on the model that might cause any kind of paint adhesion issue, things like that. Just kind of a good little practice just to give it a quick wipe down. Nothing, intense. Doesn't, you don't need to be like scrubbing it, but just wipe it down. Make sure there's nothing on the plastic. You'll notice I am using a glove. This just helps to, again, avoid oily fingerprints, things like that can possibly cause primer and paint not to stick. So we're going to go ahead and give everything a nice prime. Again, we're going to be using the Mr. Surfacer 1500 black, and everything is going to get primed up primed up with this color. So just go ahead and lay a nice coat down. Now I did manage to get the ratio good on this one, so I only needed the one coat over everything with this. And not much more to say about the primer. It is what it is. I do prefer these types of primers now over other types of primers. Pretty much the Mr. Hobby primers are my favorite. Between this and the aqueous primer, I do like the aqueous primer just a little bit more, but this is still great. It offers great adhesion and is really nice because once it dries, it cures pretty quickly, but once it's fully cure, then it's really easy to sand it, and it feathers nicely, so you don't get like some of the acrylic primers I've used. They don't really sand, they just kind of flake off, and so you end up with like ridges and lips. Not so with the lacquer primers. They really bite into the plastic, and they're very nice to work with. So like I said, we're giving everything a nice good coat of primer here, leaving nothing to unpainted. And next, we're going to start with our metallic blue. So I'm going to use this to paint the insides of the flaps. And I decided I wanted to start with these because I figured it would be a little bit easier to mask this part up and then continue painting the rest of the aircraft, as opposed to the opposite, paint the whole aircraft and then mask off the flaps. So here's the inside of the lower portion of the flaps. We also do the inside of the landing gear covers. So it all gets the metallic blue. And it's an interesting color. It really kind of stands out in terms of aircraft colors. Typically you see more of like the greens and the just the regular like aluminum colors. But go ahead and paint up the spinner here. Admittedly, Tamiya metallic colors aren't my favorite. I feel like the metal flakes in the paint are just a little bit too big, so they kind of come out a little grainy. But again, because we're doing this per the instructions and with all the stuff that Sunward Hobbies sent us, so I'm not going to complain. It was very gracious of them to send all the paints, and in the end, I think you'll agree the results look pretty good. So now we're going to go with our standard, Imperial Navy. I think it's like a gray green. To me, it's just like a gray, but I guess I can see a little bit of the green in there. So we're going to paint the whole aircraft with this color, top and bottom, and but it's not going to. The aircraft isn't going to stay gray like that. It is going to get a field applied camouflage to it. I do like just the normal gray zeros. When I did the Edward Zero as one of the Pearl Harbor attackers, I really like just the overall gray, but at the same time, like the field applied camouflage is also really cool looking, and you can get a lot of cool variations in that. So we're going to do the wing leading edges here in yellow. So these were just masked off and painted. And now I'm going to apply some decals. Now, if you've been watching my videos long enough, you'll notice that I haven't applied a gloss coat, and normally I apply a gloss coat when I'm doing decals. And in my mind, the reason I decided not to do that, one is because I feel like I got a pretty nice, like, smooth, clean paint job on there, and I've seen other people where they can apply decals over just like the normal paint job, not doing it over a gloss coat, and have like no problems. But also because I was going to have to be doing some more painting on top of the decals. So that's why I've applied the decals now, because I'm going to have to paint over them to do the field applied camouflage. And I really wanted to avoid building up too many layers of, paint, clear coat, paint, clear coat, decals, that kind of thing. So in my mind, I thought this was going to be the best course to take. And in hindsight, it didn't turn out how I wanted it to, and you'll see why in just a minute. So you can see in the background, or you can see here, that I've covered over the decals with some poster putty. The instructions show that the field applied camouflage came up to the edges of the markings and overlapped them just a little bit, but I put the blue tack on there to overall protect it from overspray and things like that, and just me not doing a good job painting. And that was the wrong thing to do. And again, you'll see why in just a minute. But I'm going to go ahead and apply the camouflage here. So based on the instructions and the reference picture that I have, the green wasn't like applied in a nice, good, solid, even coat. It was applied pretty patchy. And so I'm just trying to, get enough paint on there to show that it's there, but not necessarily like do a full coverage, trying to kind of keep it in panels, showing some, they would have been sprayed in the field, so I can't really say brush strokes, but, spray can strokes, I suppose. And so just trying to create irregularities and inconsistencies in the overall look. The rest of the markings I left uncovered, again, just because they are supposed to be sprayed over, and I wasn't worried, obviously, about like a little bit of overspray on the gas cap decals, for example. But so just go ahead and get this applied over. It takes a couple of passes in areas. I kind of wanted some areas to be a little bit stronger than other areas. And when I removed the poster putty, check out what it did to my decals. It just completely ripped my decals apart. And that was kind of a punch to the gut, as it were. And so I figured I would have to paint over them. So I removed as much of the decal as I could, and decided I'm just going to paint the markings instead. They're not going to look fabulous because I have like some leftover decal in there, and I'm not using the exact right shade of red. As I understand, there's a very specific shade of red they used for their markings, but it'll be, close enough, as it were. And in hindsight, I really should have just painted the markings to begin with, because, let's face it, if you're going to paint markings, these are probably the easiest ones to do. And so I should have done that from the beginning and not trusted the Tamiya decals. But, this is how I learn, and this is a mistake I make, and hopefully it's a mistake I only make once. But we'll see. So now I'm going to come back with the camouflage green just to kind of clean up the edges a little bit and help blend the markings in. And in the end, I end up happy with how they look overall. So now we can go ahead and start getting some other parts installed here. So we're going to do the firewall. And again, my fat fingers, I'm always dropping stuff. I don't show it very often, but I drop things quite often. And but again, Tamiya fit, fantastic. Everything goes together good. Get the engine mounted on there. And then we can go ahead and get the cowl on. The fit here is very impressive, especially with it's kind of a complex engineering thing, but it looks really good. And when you compare it to like the Tamiya, to the Edward kit that has like 5 or 6 pieces to build up the cowl, they kind of got a good way of doing it here. So now we're going to go ahead and get everything a gloss coat, and we can move on to the next stages of the build, weathering, and things like that. So everything gets a nice good solid coat. Again, we're using the Alclad Aqua Gloss. At this point, this is pretty much one of the only gloss coats that I fully trust. And not that I trust it, yeah, but it's because like I have the most experience with it, and I know what I can get out of it and what I can't get out of it. So it's just kind of come down to experience, I suppose, why I like it. So moving on, we're gonna start with the weathering. And as per my normal order of operations, after the gloss coat, we're going to do a panel wash using the Ammo MIG dark brown wash for green vehicles. Now, I do use this wash for things other than green vehicles, but I think it definitely excels at green vehicles, and it will be the case with this. And so basically, you just apply it. I mean, you can apply it like a very targeted pin wash. I find that just takes too long, and a bottle of this wash will really last me many projects. So I'm not worried about just kind of slathering it on and not necessarily being clean about it. Just kind of get it everywhere, and then once it dries, you can go ahead and wipe it off. This is just like what we did with the interior, and it removes all of the excess wash on the surface and leaves the wash in the recessed details and around raised details to give it a little bit of contrast. And I personally really love the look of a good panel wash, and I tend to probably do a darker wash than many other modelers, and I recognize that it's not everybody's cup of tea, but it works for me, and I enjoy the look of it. So go ahead and remove all the excess wash from all over the model. And I usually do this in 2 sessions. I'll usually do kind of half the model, let it dry, let it cure, wipe it off, then do the other half. It just allows me to handle it better without smudging and smearing, things like that. So you're seeing one half done. I will do the other half off camera. For stubborn areas, I like to break out a little cotton bud, and there we go. So our wash is down on both sides now. And I just like that it helps accentuate the details and the panel lines, especially on the underside where we have a little more contrast between the dark brown and the gray. But I definitely like the look. And now we can go ahead and seal all of that in with a matte varnish. So for this, I'm going to be using the Vallejo matte varnish. Go ahead and give this a nice, good, solid coat all over. And this is going to really just, lock in all of our work prior to this point, lock in that panel wash, and then give us a good canvas on which to start doing all of the rest of our weathering. And I prefer doing weathering over a matte coat because I usually don't do any kind of overcoats over my weathering. I like the weathering to have a different sheen and tone from the rest of the aircraft. I think it, especially if like you catch it just at the right angle and the light, I think it really helps to create some interest there. So at this point, because like I said, we're not going to be doing any more clear coats over the aircraft, I can go ahead and remove the canopy masking. This is not necessary to do at this point. This is just usually me getting excited to see how it's going to look and just not being patient enough to wait until the end. So that's why I'm removing it at this point. But as you can see, the Tamiya masks did a good job. There was a couple of places where the masks kind of were lifting a little bit, and so I had to do a little bit of cleanup. And then you'll notice here, and I didn't explain this prior to putting the canopies on, but you can see inside the canopy I have a little piece of tape, and that is because there's actually an opening at the rear of the canopy there, and I found that adding a little bit of tape in there that I can then remove later on in the build makes it so that I don't get any overspray inside the cockpit where that hole is. And then I can just go ahead and close up the canopy again. I didn't intend to have the canopy open on this kit. I always intended to have a closed canopy, and which is kind of contrary to what I normally do. I normally like to have an open canopy just because I like to be able to see into the cockpit, see all that work. But for what I have future plans for this aircraft, and so it kind of all lines up with that. So now I'm going to start doing some chipping, and I wanted to show some wear and and distress on the aircraft, but I really wanted it to look layered. And so I'm starting off by adding chipping to the actual camouflage paint. So being a field applied camouflage, the camouflage paint would not have been like, expertly applied and gone through the whole process of proper primers and all these things. It would have been pretty hasty and wouldn't have had the best adhesion and stuff. And so the camouflage paint oftentimes will chip or wear down before the actual like proper layer of paint on the aircraft. And so that's what I'm really trying to represent here, is that camouflage layer that's being worn away and chipped away. And I ultimately decided to do it with a brush as opposed to like the sponge method that I showed you in the cockpit, or doing like a chipping fluid underneath the paint. This, even though it's tedious and it takes longer, you do have ultimate control of every single chip, and so it is a little time consuming, but I think the results can be worth it if you do it right. And so really what I'm trying to do here is concentrate my chipping in areas where the ground crew and the pilot would be handling the aircraft. So a lot of that is around the cockpit, around the upper surfaces of the wings, where the fuel tanks would be filled, where the guns would be reloaded, where debris might be getting kicked up from the airfield that they're operating from and hitting the leading edges of the wings, things like that in my mind makes sense, right? Like I just don't see there's going to be a lot of like chipping on the the sides of the rudders or the tail, for example, just because how often are the crew members going to be up there doing something, right? So now we're going to start adding a little bit of oil weathering to this, and I'm going to initially I'm going to try and doing things a little bit differently than I normally do, applying the oil paint more dry to the model and then blending it. But in the end, I wasn't like super satisfied with how it was going, and so I eventually kind of revert to my more traditional method where I wet the whole thing with thinner and then apply my oil paints. But I was able to get some interesting little blending here around certain panels, and where it would make sense to me, where dirt and dust from the airfield would accumulate, and where the ground crew's shoes would pick up things like that. And I know, like, in general, the Japanese ground crew were usually pretty clean, at least from some of the reference pictures I saw, but so I could be wrong about that. But so I'm not trying to go like super heavy, but again, like recognizing that this was a worn aircraft. It had seen its fair share of combat and was operating from unimproved airfields in the South Pacific. I had figured any type of artistic license could account for that, and in the dirtying it up. What I really wanted to make sure that I was doing was giving a lot of accumulation and grime to the underside of the aircraft. Again, where you're going to be getting a lot of the airfield debris being kicked up, and if it's the rainy season or whatever, you're going to get a lot of like variation in spots. So what I'm doing now is basically just loading up a brush with really, really thin oil paint and then kind of just flicking it onto the aircraft, allowing it to create these random patterns. And I kind of let that build up over a couple of sessions, and a couple of different layers of colors. And it's really subtle. This is really heavily thinned, but I think as it builds up, you get a really good look, sense of kind of the accumulation. And again, trying to kind of keep it more concentrated along the center line of the aircraft as opposed to just randomly anywhere, that type of thing. So we'll do a couple little fuel streaks here along the fuel tank fillers, and we can kind of blend that back in along the direction of the airflow. You'll also notice that I did do a little bit of gun soot staining for the leading edge of the guns, and now I'm going to do some exhaust here. And for this, I am using Outlaw Paints Black. This is an acrylic lacquer, and when thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner, you can get this stuff super thin and it without any and still be able to spray it nicely. And what this does, it allows me to then have a lot of control over how much exhaust staining that I want to paint on, and let that build up in a couple of layers until I'm happy with it. But yeah, so the Outlaw paints have really become kind of my go-to for doing exhaust and things like that. But one thing you need to remember is to don't forget doing the exhaust staining on the wheel covers. Because when the wheels are retracted, the covers do fall in line directly with the exhaust staining. So now with the weathering done, we can kind of go ahead and start putting everything together. And so you get a polycap here for the propeller. That's a pretty common thing amongst Tamiya aircraft kits. And so the hub and the propeller get it built up. I do like the colors on the Japanese propellers. You know, they have the combination of the aluminum and the red brown on the back side. The front portion of the spinner did get a little bit of camouflage paint on it. And so that's kind of a neat little detail. At this point, we can go ahead and remove a lot of the parts that we had still on the sprue, to aid in painting, so that we can get these all assembled together. Landing gear going together. The little spot that I was shaving off on the bottom is just a little flat spot so that I can have have a flat spot for the wheels to rest on when the aircraft is on its wheels. Just makes it look slightly better. I mean, obviously weight on wheels type of thing would look the best, but this works. So one thing I do want to do at this point right now is use this gallery aluminum pen to paint the navigation lights. So this is going to kind of be as it were, the base coat for the navigation lights, because I'll then do a clear color over them. But the gallery acrylic metallic pens are quite nice and have really strong pigment in them, and look pretty good. The applicator tip is a little large, and so sometimes if you're trying to reach a hard to reach place, they don't work so well. But overall, I've been liking them so far. I've been using them on a few builds now, and they've been working pretty good. So all the landing gear pieces get to go together, and again, because of Tamiya engineering, it all just fits together very nicely. Very positive locating tabs, and very little fiddling about. I think the fiddliest parts are these little parts that I'm applying with the tweezer. But again, once you finally get them where they need to go, then they're in, and you don't have to worry about them. So we can go ahead and get the drop tank installed. Again, this is done with a polycap, so we don't even need to glue that. And nice and positive there. Go ahead and get the flaps installed. I do really love the way that these attach. They got that big tab that fits into the wing, and which is perfect because it sets the correct angle for the flaps for where they're supposed to go. Landing gear goes in. Again, these are keyed, so you can't really mess up left and right kind of a thing. And go ahead and give that a chance to cure. Let that glue dry. Get the prop installed. And finally, we're going to go ahead and hit our navigation lights with some clear Tamiya paint here. So we got green on one side, red on the other. And yeah, pretty straightforward. Again, because we're doing it over the aluminum color, the actual clear color really stands out. Get the wingtip lights installed. So these are just a clear part that go on, and fit there was great. No issues there. Definitely one of those things that I always like to leave off until the very end. If I can, if it can be avoided, that kind of a thing. You also notice that I got the Pitot 2 installed. But there we go. So hope you're all ready for the final reveal here. Yeah, this was a fantastic kit. I can't really fault Tamiya. Like I said, there's a couple ejector pin marks in the flaps, and then obviously the decals aren't my favorite, but in the end, the kit itself is brilliant, looks good, and I'm really pleased with how this one turned out. And This was a lot of fun. I definitely need to add more Japanese aircraft to my collection. They do have a lot of fun painting options and weathering options, and can make for some interesting visuals. Again, I'm taking a little bit of liberty here with like the wingtips folded up, because I know that's probably unlikely to happen with a land-based aircraft, but I think it looks cool. And I hope you'll stay tuned, because I will have a second part for this video, as I do plan on creating a full diorama for this aircraft. So stay tuned. That will be coming. I'm still slowly working on it. So I finished this actual aircraft back in November, at the very end of November. So it's been a few months, but I have slowly been working on the diorama. I'm pretty close to being done with it. So hopefully sooner rather than later, we'll have another video for this one. But I hope you enjoyed the video. If you've managed to stay this long, thank you so much. I really appreciate the support. I would like to give a huge shout out to my patrons for supporting this channel and helping me to bring this type of content to you. If you would like to consider supporting the channel, head on over to Patreon, have a look. Otherwise, if you liked the video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and leave me a comment down below. I really like to hear from you. I like the feedback. Tell me what you like about it, what you don't like about it. What can I improve, that kind of a thing. I'm always trying to learn something new, and I've learned a lot from the comments so far. So keep it up, guys. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I hope we'll see you on the next video, and I hope you all have happy modeling. Take care, everyone. Cheers.